So for this presentation, I wanted to make a very little introduction because it's a follow-on somehow on a presentation which was last year from Bruno Roux and Michael Jaune from l'Avion Jaune. They showed how they operated UAV with LiDAR in Bolivia under quite tough conditions, and how the mission was going. And now we have Doyle McKey and Cedric Krasnopolsky. Doyle is a researcher at CNRS, and he was our customer actually. He ordered the mission, and I would say there is a three time in this mission. The first was operational. We go there, we collect the data. So this was what was presented last year. Now you will have from Doyle the context, the scientific context, and why we are doing that, and from Cedric how we process the data and what we can measure from the data. This is the second stage, I would say. And hopefully next year we will have the third stage with the scientific results from these measurements.
Okay, well this is another story about humans and how they interact with environments, but it's in some ways a happier story because what we will see here is humans in an originally homogeneous, flat, shallowly flooded landscape created a heterogeneous landscape with high spots and low spots, which in fact enhance the local biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. Okay, we'll be going eventually to Bolivia, but I want to say first, this first cover slide is from the Republic of Congo. The next set of slides you'll be seeing from me are mostly in French Guiana, where we have carried out several missions using mostly photogrammetry. I've used them because they're best for developing the questions which Cedric is going to talk to you about in the other part of this paper. Okay, so what's going on here? What are these pre-Columbian raised fields? Okay, in fact, if you look at seasonal wetlands around the Amazon basin in many parts of South America, in Bolivia, in the Colombian and Venezuela llanos, and here in the coastal savannas of French Guiana, in many of these wetland environments, pre-Columbian inhabitants made these raised fields. These are seasonally flooded areas, sometimes permanently flooded areas, and the only way to plant crops was to make a raised planting surface. And they came in various shapes and sizes, sometimes mounds, sometimes long ridges, and sometimes a mix of them. Okay, here's what they look like close up. These are seasonally flooded areas. This is the same area in the dry season and the rainy season. In the rainy season, it's full of water about that high. And as you see, there are hundreds of little isolated, well-drained islands, and these are the vestiges of raised fields made by pre-Columbian farmers, in this case about 700 years ago. Okay, and in the dry season, they look like this, and fires go across, and so on. These were abandoned at the latest around the time of the European conquest. So at least 500 years. We have to imagine them as we see them now and as they were then. Okay, this is an artist rendition based on archaeological data of a village on the higher sites, permanent water, and raised fields in the seasonally flooded wetlands. Now, this is a challenging environment for LiDAR because what we have are very small elevational differences can make a huge difference in duration of flooding, depth of flooding, and anoxic or oxic conditions in the soil. Very small elevational differences are extremely important. Another question, why are they still there 500 years after being abandoned? You have an area which can get up to 3 to 4 meters of high energy tropical rainfall every year. In the dry season, they're often burned, so the vegetation is decreased. All of this should favor erosion. But these have not been worked by humans for at least 500 years, and they're still there. Why? Well, as an ecologist working with archaeologists on questions looking not only at the history of these landscapes, but also their ecology, the answer turned out to be ecology. In fact, when you look at these mounds, you see that a lot has happened to them since they were abandoned over 500 years by people. If you look at these mounds, all of these are little islands of well-drained soil in an otherwise flooded landscape. Animals and plants flock to these well-drained sites. And among the animals and plants that are lots of plants, the only shrubs growing in this area are on the raised fields. Plant density is highest on the raised fields, their ancient vestiges, than in the matrix that is seasonally flooded, so the root density is higher. Ants, earthworms, and termites are all concentrated on these raised fields. Now, what does this mean? These well-drained islands are colonized by organisms, and looking at the scale, we're talking about a difference in elevation of about this today. We don't know what it was then, but today it's about this. So in the dry season, ants and termites, earthworms, they can move all over, forage everywhere. But in the rainy season, everything is flooded, and the only places ants and termites can build their nest and stick around, and the only places earthworms can come up for air while foraging in soil in the rainy season is in the mounds. So they concentrate on the mounds because well-drained soil is a key resource. And for example, ants and termites, they all build their nests only in the mounds. You never find a nest in the flooded matrix. And these animals are central place foragers. That means they bring things to a central place, which is the nest. So they're continually bringing things to the mounds. This is a leaf-cutting, fungus-growing ant that brings lots of material. After the fungus uses it, it turns out in detritus, which is deposited on the mound. So organic matter is continually added to these abandoned raised fields. All of the activities of the roots and the soil animals create a much more porous soil on the raised fields. This is an experiment looking at water penetration capacity, which is 10 times higher here than here. So instead of running off laterally, the water infiltrates, and so erosion is decreased. So our idea on this is that these soil engineers, plants and animals, maintain the abandoned raised fields against erosion because they deposit mineral and organic matter specifically on these mounds. They modify the physical and the chemical properties of soils of the mounds, making them more porous. And so the engineers deposit material and stabilize material on the mounds, and that is what has prevented the mounds from eroding. So our model here is that these are landscapes that are co-constructed by humans and then later re-engineered by animals. What this means is that to understand and interpret these archaeological landscapes, we have to know how they have changed in the meantime. What are the effects of these animals? Okay, so this balance between erosion and deposition and stabilization should vary with ecological conditions. For example, where the basin is a little bit lower, it's going to be flooded for a longer part of the year. Termites and ants will have less time in the dry season to forage and bring things to mounds. So what we wonder is, do places like this represent areas where erosion was greater than deposition? And is that related to ecological conditions that affect engineers? And areas like this, were these mounds just built bigger by the Indians, or have they grown since being abandoned? Okay, so we have to find out what animals and plants have been doing with these areas since people abandoned them. Okay? So, questions that we need to ask are, for example, what environmental conditions affect this balance between erosion and deposition and stabilization? One of the obvious things we need to look at is the digital terrain model of the basin without the mounds. Is there greater erosion in areas where engineers have less time in the year to act? What kind of indicators can we find of varying degree of erosion? And one thing that we certainly need to look at to start with is the size of the mounds, whether they're small or big, the irregularity of their three-dimensional shape. The Indians made nice regular mounds, but some of these mounds we see are not that shape. Does that indicate erosion? Also, these savannas, in the meantime, have been colonized by forest, which grows in, and we don't know how much of this forested area is also covered by archaeological raised fields. We need to be able to look beneath the woody vegetation. Okay, so those are some of the questions. Cedric is going to give you some of the methods and results for attacking these questions, and come back next year and we will have all the answers.